June 16, 2026. A message lands in a police building in Vitória, the capital of Espírito Santo, a small coastal state in Brazil most people outside the country have never had a reason to learn the name of. But the message didn't come from a tip line. It came from a server in California, by way of the FBI. By way of Brazil's Ministry of Justice. A few weeks before that, a man in the Brazilian countryside had started talking to ChatGPT the same way people talk to a diary, not asking questions or just asking questions, but telling it things, what he wanted to do. And turned out what he wanted to do was a crime. What he already had around the house to do it with, who he had tried to hire to do it for him. He thought he was talking to no one, but he was actually talking to a company's safety system. And then, 4 days before he planned the act, to a cybercrime unit on the other side of the planet that had exactly 96 hours to find him. Hi guys, I actually have a list of episodes that I want to publish for the beginning of this podcast, but I just saw this case and it is really interesting. Like, I've heard about crimes involving AI, but I never heard about anything like this. So I decided to skip my list altogether. I mean, there's no one watching me, so I think law and order, right? But anyway, please let me know if there is any cases or any stories like this in your country, because I'm super curious, and please let me know your thoughts. Say Espírito Santo to any person outside Brazil and the maximum you'll get is a blank look. Espírito Santo is a small state on Brazil's southeast coast, just north from Rio. Mountainous once you get past the beach town tourists actually visit. Drive a few hours inland from the coast and you'll end up somewhere like São Gabriel da Palha, a farming town of roughly 30,000 people in the state's northwest. Coffee country, the kind of place where a stranger asking questions gets noticed by lunchtime. Police find their man in a rural district of the town called Farturinha, which, for what it's worth, translates roughly to little abundance. He is a farmer, 36 years old. Brazilian law lets police withhold the suspect's name before formal charges are filed, and this is still the case. So for the rest of the episode, I'm gonna refer to him as the suspect, which, quite frankly, is a more generous label than the story earns him. Here's what investigators have laid out about his life. He had an 8-year-old son with an ex-partner. He wasn't in contact with the boy, hadn't been for some time, according to police. What he was in contact with every month was a legal obligation to pay called in Brazil pensão alimentícia. It's a child support that in Brazil follows a parent whether or not they are active in their kid's life. Somewhere along the way, again, according to the investigation, he stopped seeing that bill as something to pay and started seeing it as something to eliminate. And of course, alongside with it was the child who generated the pension. What separates this case from any ordinary murder-for-hire case is that the suspect wrote almost all of it down. And I'm not talking in a note or in a text to an accomplice. It was actually a chat window. So the same interface you and me use to draft emails, settle arguments, or anything else. According to the police account, he told the AI he had a gun, a rope, and cyanide. He wrote he had offered a hitman 50,000 reais to kill his son, which is around $10,000, give it or take. The hitman, according to the investigation, turned the job down the moment he found out the target was an 8 years old. But this didn't stop his father. Here is the number that actually stops you though. Brazilian law doesn't set a legal minimum for child support. But in practice, courts default to a rough floor of around 30% of the national minimum wage, when there's no other income to calculate from. So let's call it roughly $100 per month, 500 reais. I tried to find it anywhere, but I couldn't confirm the amount that he was actually paying. But at that floor, the cheapest a Brazilian court would plausibly have made him pay 50,000 reais, so $10,000 that he would pay the hitman, is over 100 months worth of pension. More than 8 years of payments handed over in one lump sum to make a single monthly bill disappear. And let's remember that if the kid is 8 now, now the suspect would pay for the pension until he is 18, so he would pay for 10 years more, which is not that much of a difference. The son wasn't the ceiling of the plan. Investigators say he told the chatbot he was thinking about going after police officers near a local battalion. He even talked about wanting to get into school and churches to rack up, in his own words, as investigators paraphrased them, as many victims as possible. He said he wanted to become known for it around town. There is a specific kind of horror in mass casualty fantasy that arrives folded inside a custody dispute, like an afterthought. Delegate Ícaro Olímpio, the deputy chief of the state's cybercrime unit, called the planned act as extremely grave and said the unit treated the timeline with total seriousness once they understood it. Understandably, right? Here's the detail that turns this from a straightforward, monstrous story into a specific Brazilian one, and it requires a short legal detour for us. So, police says the suspect's motivation wasn't just avoiding the pension itself, it was the fear that his ex-partner would try to go after the suspect's mother to get the pension. Here's the thing. In Brazil, that's not a hypothetical fear. Under Brazilian family law, child support, it is framed as a duty of the whole family line. So, if a father can't or won't pay, courts can, in certain circumstances, reach up a generation and make the grandparents pay it instead. It's called pensão avoenga, and Brazil's High Court has spent the better part of a decade refining exactly when it applies, which means it's not automatic. But it's real enough that family lawyers write entire articles about how to avoid triggering it. So, somewhere in this man's head, according to what police says he told the AI, killing his son wasn't only about the money. It was, in his twisted account, about protecting his own mother. So let's call it what it is. He framed part of a murder of an 8-year-old who was his child as an act of family loyalty. That's the closest thing this case has to a label for the title card. Not because it's particularly clever, but it's the single detail that tells you exactly how far a person can rationalize their way from a bill to a body count. That, again, happens to be his son. Let's talk a little bit about how a chatbot ends up doing what, in this story, several actual humans in this man's life apparently didn't. OpenAI has said publicly that conversations get screened on 2 levels: automated systems trained to flag violent or self-harm content, and human reviewers who look at anything the algorithm kicks upstairs. According to the company, most flagged chats get closed out as low risk. However, this one had what OpenAI's own public statements describe as the threshold for real intervention: a named victim, a state method, and a date. Once all these elements are presented in one place, the company says it can, not must, can notify authorities. It is worth knowing this wasn't happening in a vacuum. 2026 has been actually a really rough year for ChatGPT's reputation, especially as a bystander in violent cases. Weeks before this arrest, Florida's Attorney General filed a suit against OpenAI and personally CEO over a teenager suicide that happened a year before, after months of the boy discussing his plans with the bot in detail. That same file referenced an active investigation into whether the AI had answered questions for a shooter before a university campus attack, and cited a separated double murder case in which the accused reportedly asked the bot what happens physically when a body is left in a bag inside a container. Assume for a second that the system worked exactly as intended in this one case. Here's what working as intended physically looked like. OpenAI's system flagged the conversation and escalated it internally. Then the company notified FBI, its home jurisdiction, since OpenAI is a US company. The FBI then passed the material to a unit inside Brazil's Ministry of Justice and Public Security, which routed it down to state level. the police in Espírito Santo, specifically its cybercrime division. Delegate Breno Andrade, who runs that division, told local press the unit has spent close to 8 years building exactly this kind of international pipeline with the FBI. The delegate also said something worth sitting with. As far as his unit was told, this was only the third case nationally where an AI platform's report to authorities led anywhere. The first one in Espírito Santo. Once the alert landed on June 16, investigators cross-referenced the chat content against public records, confirmed the man existed, confirmed he had a son matching the description, and went to a judge for a preventive arrest warrant and a search and seizure order. They executed both on June 19, one day before the planned crime. In his statement, the suspect admitted to doing the research. What he denied flatly was ever intending to actually carry on any of it out. The delegate's response to that, the confession to the searches matters more than the denial of intent. And the next step was comparing what he had typed against whatever forensics could pull off the seized phone. Messages, contacts, anything suggesting the hitman offer went further than the chat window. Here's where we are now and where we are going to. Now I'm going to be really honest with you, and I'm not gonna manufacture a clean verdict where it doesn't exist. Brazilian criminal law recognizes a concept called iter criminis, the path a crime travels before it happens. We have 4 stages: thinking about it, preparing it, attempting it, and completing it. Under Brazilian law, the first 2 stages generally aren't punishable on their own. Basically, you're legally allowed to think about killing someone, and in most circumstances you can even buy the rope. The law generally only stops once you cross into the 3rd stage, the actual attempt. So the live legal question now isn't whether the suspect wrote that chatbot or not, because everyone agrees he has. It's whether offering money to a hitman and stockpiling a weapon, a rope, and cyanide counted as preparation or as the beginning of an attempt. Legal analysis covering the case have been careful to say this generally isn't settled. Nobody wrote Brazil's penal code with chatbot transcripts in mind, and a judge is going to have to draw a line that doesn't currently exist in the letter of the law. There is also a second argument buried in this case, and it's less about the case itself and more about the system that caught it. A Brazilian digital law specialist raised a pointed question in the aftermath. Why did the first call go to the FBI at all? The crimes, the alleged victim, and the suspects were all Brazilians and in Brazil. Arguably, the report should have gone straight to Brazil's own federal police, instead of routing through an American law enforcement agency first. In a case with a 4-day runway is not a trivial delay. The counter-argument is also very simple. OpenAI is a US company, so the FBI is its natural first call. And the alternative, the one where every AI company builds bespoke reporting relationships with 100+ countries' domestic police forces, isn't really on the table. Nobody built that infrastructure, and this case is truly an argument for building it. And underneath all these questions sits a bigger issue nobody has fully answered. No Brazilian law currently requires any AI company to report anything like this to anyone. OpenAI did it because its own terms of service allow it, when there is a credible risk to life, which means that was a corporate policy choice, not a legal mandate. Which means the next company facing the same situation isn't obligated to make the same call. As of this recording, no formal indictment. Investigators are still weighing charges that could include attempted homicide, threat, incitement to crime, and glorification of crime, pending what the phone forensics actually confirm, including whether the hitman was ever a real person or something he imagined. All in all, this episode doesn't end in a tidy way because we don't have a trial date yet. We don't even have the suspect's name released. But what there is this. An 8-year-old boy is alive right now, and the reason wasn't a neighbor who noticed something was wrong, or maybe a family court system that was built to protect him. It is a language model, a piece of commercial software built to answer random questions that happen to be paying enough attention to flag the suspect's diary entries as something other than just venting. That's not an amazing note, to be honest. It's a very uncomfortable one because it is a machine that did what several humans that are most probably than not closer to this child than any server in California. It was a machine that did all the work. And now that we have people to do the rest, we just don't know what to do. My name is Nal. See you next week, and I hope you like this episode.